now I got the mic to just block all this shit. So, haha! Celebrate! Celebration! Hello, guys. I'm Soul, and I kind of got my voice back. Yay! Still got crap stuck in my throat, but I'll deal with it. So, a week or so ago, I got my first question. Woo. Someone's actually interested in what I think about a thing. And it was a guildmate, but I'm gonna take what I can get. So here we go. Shattuck asked, "Do you think WoW is too easy?" That was my reaction when I first saw the question. I'm like, I was hoping that I would get like, "Hey, do a 5 top dances night elf females do on the mailbox back in the day," or tell us some funny stories. So thanks for the really broad question that I won't really be able to answer. Here we go. So, is WoW too easy? It's a really loaded question to ask about a game that's over 11 years old. And I've read and seen stuff that says, oh, it's easy because leveling isn't a challenge anymore. Rating accomplishments just aren't the rare and exclusive achievement that they used to be. And the epic feel of exploring a dungeon has all but gone away. Those statements might be true in the most basic context, but they only scratch the surface on answering the real question. WoW is a huge game. It's going to take more than a video or two to understand what's happened to WoW over the years. I'm going to focus on a few key areas that could help you draw your own informed conclusion. But here's a spoiler. There is no easy answer. And even if the answer is yes, WoW is too easy, that doesn't make the game any more or less appealing. So first, I'll talk about leveling, and I'll break this down into 3 components: combat, quests, and dungeons. Questing and dungeons, those are kind of optional, but combat is definitely at the forefront of WoW's gameplay, so we'll talk about that first. Combat out in the open world had a certain dangerous feel to it, more so than all the savage, dangerous, talk that was meant to describe warlords of Draenor. This feeling had to do with the early world combat designs of WoW. Now I'm going to call this mob density, and back then there was a lot of it. Pulling one mob typically meant pulling multiple mobs that were next to it, and there were a lot of places in old Azeroth that had this. And if you were alone, it could fucking suck. Class roles just weren't as independent as they are today, except for maybe pet classes. But in general, tanks had great survivability, but really poor damage and self-healing. Damage dealers obviously did great damage, and had the advantage of crowd control, but it was a struggle without a pet. And even with one, you probably had to eat and drink a lot between fights. I'd say healers had it worst of all, but generally, if you're not in a group, you were probably spec'd for DPS if you wanted to get anywhere. This made the open world into a kind of puzzle game whenever you're trying to reach a quest objective, and it shared some similarities to navigating through dungeons. Thinking back, it was a bit weird, but it was the norm. You picked up the quest, you go to the quest area, and then whoa, stop. Now it's time to think of how to fight your way through without aggroing half the zone. Funny enough, this is very different to the pro flight threads we see with players demanding the right to fly over all obstacles and go straight to their objective. Now there are 2 big problems with this sort of mob density. One is respawning. Mobs need to respawn sometime. When the spawn rate is too high, players questing through have to beat the spawn timer, otherwise mobs could reappear right on top of them, and that's where you get yourself into trouble if you're a tank or a healer. If the spawn rate is too low, well, then we start conversations about quest bottlenecks, shared mob tagging, and so on. The other is the fault of players running through the quest area and trying to hold packs with them. That doesn't make for much fun either if the challenge is trivialized, or worse if these packs return and knock your ass out. Whatever Blizzard philosophies on world design are today, they've clearly gone in a new direction from the original iteration. The high mob density in old puzzle game has gone by the wayside in favor of more expanded combat zones for quest usage, and thus a wider spread of mobs. The world is as big as it ever was, but more real estate is effectively being used, giving the impression of a more dense world, so to speak. This is where you see the argument that the world is smaller, where the reality of it is that more of it's being used. Over the years, the tank, healer, and DPS role were given an expanded toolkit to handle content on their own. Tanks were given more damage buttons and self-healing capability. DPS were given damage mitigation abilities and some self-healing. Healer damage has gone up, and in Legion, Blizzard intends to improve their toolkit even further. Resource management has also changed, going away from needing high mana pools and focusing more on meaningful cooldowns and using priority skills. Effectively, this was a huge improvement for solo players who had to struggle harder to get by. Those who played in groups weren't affected nearly as much. This didn't mean that soloing was incredibly difficult, mind you, but it does appear that Blizzard shifted the bar. They don't want to punish solo players, but still want to reward those who travel in a group. Early on, questing was primarily a device to level the player while telling the story. At the start of WoW, there was a lot of land to cover, very few established characters to work with, and a quest and story team that didn't quite have the MMO experience they do today. So we got whatever, wherever. We got Mankrik and his lovely wife, we had whatever it was the Horde did in the Swamp of Sorrows, and if I recall correctly, Alliance had no quests there. We had an epic quest line for hunters and priests, and Jack Squat for everyone else. We had an epic mount quest for paladins and warlocks, and Jack Squat for everyone else. I guess to better sum things up, there were two types of quests in early WoW. There were the ones that were confined to their own zones, and there were the ones that took you all over the world. And for the latter, those could get really tedious. So I remember this quest, it was in the Shimmering Flats. It was just rock salt everywhere. It was super flat, super lazy design. It was just flats and nothing, and a racetrack with a goblin and a gnome that were going at it. That's all it was. While I was there, I got a quest to go to Dustwallow Marsh. So I had to walk south. I had to walk. I'm pretty sure I was not level 40 at the time. I had to be level 40 and have 90 gold. So now you had to walk south to Gadgetzan, then take the flight point to, I think it was Camp Taraho. Yeah, Camp Taraho at the time. Then walk east to Dustwallow Marsh, because I haven't been there yet. Once you go there, you go north a little bit so you can get the flight point there at that one little encampment. Then you actually go do the quest that you're trying to do. Then you hop back on the flight point, fly all the way back to Gadgetzan, go north, back up to Shimmering Flats, talk to the guy, quest giver guy, and that was one quest. Fuck. There were, of course, some really cool and fulfilling quest lines that took us all over the world. That was the intention. There were two huge continents of story to experience. But it was as soon as BC when Blizzard learned that too much downtime for just traveling wasn't very good for you. And nearly all but the max level quests were confined to each zone. And it's only evolved since then, to the current quest design we have now. A very linear path from hub to hub that tells the overall story of the zone, followed by a transition to the next area. So today, for better or worse, questing is primarily a device to tell the story, while leveling the player. And that's going to be flipped on its head too with Legion, which I still have no alpha invite for. The world scaling tech that's coming with Legion will lift the old restriction of playing in a zone that's appropriate to your level. What I mean by that is that it's not going to matter what zone you play in, monsters and quests and dungeons will always be at your level. We can bet that zones will still have specific stories tied to it, but unlike the Warlords model where all quests were tied to the grand story, they can go to a model similar to Mists or even Lich King, where numerous small, unrelated stories led to a larger questline. Dungeons used to be a crawl, like a slow crawl through mountains of trash, but players missed the epic size of places like Blackrock Depths, Sunken Temple, and even Wailing Caverns. Today we have what some call glorified hallways that take us from boss room to boss room, and depending on your motivation, they can be cleared in just a few minutes as opposed to hours back in the day. So what happened? What turned an adventure in exploration into a leveling device? First, the priority in dungeon design shifted away from complicated environments and more towards the boss encounters. Dungeon bosses back then were basically tank in space, and the difficulty lay mostly with the gear. As expansions rolled out, we started to see bosses do more cool things, have phase changes, and have the environment around them interact with the encounter in some ways. The polish that was reserved for raid encounters was coming to dungeons, though unfortunately level design had to suffer for it. I only consider myself an armchair designer, but I do know that creating these encounters takes considerable amounts of time and resources to do. It's already been said that designing boss encounters can be quick, but it is time consuming, because designers have to wait for the environments to be finished before encounter building can begin. The other and more obvious reason for the paradigm shift was the Looking for Dungeon tool. Its launch pretty much sealed the dungeon's fate as a game device. It's been referred to as something to do while on a lunch break, or a fast pickup activity while digesting your WoW for the day. The LFD tool took away from dungeons the primary elements that make dungeons kind of crappy: a lack of players, and a lack of good players. Back in the day, if you wanted to do a Sunken Temple run, you needed a good chunk of time to find a group, get there, not suck, and then make it all the way to the end. And as sad as that sounds, those were some pretty big barriers to overcome if you didn't have your own guild, or your server just didn't have a lot of players willing to do it at your schedule. I myself never finished Sunken Temple when it was current content, nor Blackrock Depths, even though I tried pretty hard to do both. We don't do dungeon crawls anymore, they're dungeon runs now. As for why, that's only something I can speculate, but I could bet that there are more players now that have at least seen dungeons than before LFD was introduced. Dang, and that's it for right now. Like I said, this is a really hard question to answer because it's really, really broad. I thought up these couple of things to talk about, although I know that there's so much more. So I'll have a part 2 and I'll talk about gearing and raiding, because, those are the good parts. But if there are more specific things that you guys would like me to do an analysis on, just shoot me a comment below or wherever. I could definitely use more. So thanks for watching. I'm Soul. Stay breezy.